The Black Death, the devastating plague pandemic that struck Europe in the 14th century, has a dramatic and often cited origin story involving the Siege of Caffa, also spelled Caffa, a Genoese-controlled port on the Crimean Peninsula. Here's an overview of what happened. Siege of Caffa and the origins of the Black Death in Europe. Date: 1346. Location: Caffa, modern-day Feodosia, Crimea. Context: ongoing conflict between the Genoese merchants and the Mongol, Tatar, forces of the Golden Horde. What happened? The city of Caffa was a bustling Genoese trading port on the Black Sea. It was a key hub for commerce between Europe and Asia, and its control was contested. In 1346, the city was besieged by the Mongol forces of the Golden Horde, led by Johnny Beg. During the siege, Mongol troops began to die in large numbers from an unknown disease. What we now know was the bubonic plague, carried by fleas on rats. According to some historical accounts, especially from Gabriele de Mussi, an Italian notary writing shortly after the events, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls in an early form of biological warfare. Spread to Europe, the Genoese defenders, despite the siege, managed to escape by sea, carrying the disease with them. Ships fleeing Caffa brought the plague to Constantinople, Sicily, Genoa, and Venice, helping to ignite the Black Death pandemic across Europe. Within a few years, the plague would kill an estimated 25 to 50 million people in Europe, 1/3 to 1/2 of the continent's population. Historical debate. The story of corpse flinging as biological warfare is widely cited, but modern historians debate its accuracy. It's unclear whether the plague entered Caffa primarily through this method, or simply through infected rats and fleas that were part of normal commerce and daily life. Nonetheless, the Siege of Caffa remains a pivotal moment, a confluence of warfare, trade, and disease that likely played a major role in bringing the Black Death to Europe. Historical weight of the Siege of Caffa and the ensuing spread of the Black Death into Europe. Caffa, 1346, the Gates of Death. The year was 1346, and the salty winds off the Black Sea carried more than the scent of salt and war. The city of Caffa, a jewel of Genoese ambition, sat entrenched behind thick stone walls, its towers bristling with crossbows, its harbor teeming with merchant ships. To the west lay the open sea and salvation. To the east, a sea of tents and war engines belonging to the Golden Horde, Mongol warriors under the command of Khan Johnny Beg, whose siege had dragged on for months. At first, it had been a siege like many others. Arrows, stones, shouts across the battlefield. But then, without warning, the rhythm of war changed. The Mongol ranks began to thin, not from battle, but from disease. Men stumbled from their tents with black boils under their arms and groins, their bodies racked with fever and the stench of rot. Within days, death ran rampant through the Tatar camp. Corpses piled high under the Crimean sun. Then came the unthinkable. What if, the Mongol commanders asked, we let the dead fight for us? With grim ingenuity, they loaded the plague-ridden corpses onto catapults, once used to hurl stones, and launched them over Caffa's walls, sending bloated bodies crashing into courtyards and streets. The defenders, horrified, tried to burn and bury them quickly, but the damage had been done. Inside the city, rats scurried from ship to house, and the fleas they carried sank their teeth into new hosts. The disease, now recognized as Yersinia pestis, was no longer outside the gates. It was inside. The Genoese knew the siege could no longer be held. They fled. Many boarding ships bound for Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, and Venice, unknowingly becoming the vessels of death themselves. The plague crosses. The sea, the first signs of plague in Constantinople appeared within months. From there it spread with terrifying speed, riding trade routes and merchant ships like an invisible rider. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Sicily. By 1348, it was in Florence, Paris, and London, In some towns, the population would fall by 70%. Entire families died overnight. Clergy collapsed mid-prayer. Villages were left to the weeds. Chroniclers wrote of bodies stacked like firewood, of carts full of corpses, of dogs and pigs gnawing on the dead in empty streets. And it all began at Caffa. Of the siege, though historians debate whether the Mongols truly weaponized the plague, the Siege of Caffa remains one of the earliest documented instances of biological warfare. More than that, it marks the turning point where a local outbreak became a continental catastrophe. In its wake, Europe would never be the same. The Black Death reshaped societies, shattered faith, collapsed economies, and left a cultural scar that would echo for centuries. After the storm, Europe in the wake of the Black Death. When the ships sailed from Caffa, they carried more than men and silk and gold. They bore a silent, invisible terror that would remake a continent. By 1351, the plague had burned its way through Europe, leaving a map speckled with the dead. Historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people perished worldwide, with Europe alone losing nearly half its population. But death was only the beginning. The collapse of the old order in the decades before the plague, Europe's rigid feudal system had seemed unshakable. Kings ruled by divine right. Nobles owned the land. Serfs toiled beneath them, bound by custom, debt, and blood. But as bodies piled up, so too did change. Fields went fallow. Entire villages vanished, their inhabitants gone. Labor became scarce, a commodity for the first time in generations. Serfs, once tethered to land and lord, found themselves in demand. They walked away from manors, seeking higher wages and better conditions. In some regions, peasants began to negotiate, and where that failed, they rebelled. The Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381, and similar uprisings across Europe were the direct consequence of a shattered demographic reality. Too few workers, too much need. The social pyramid had cracked, faith fractured and fear embodied. The church, mighty, eternal, unquestioned, had offered no shelter. Bishops, priests, and monks had died by the tens of thousands. Those who remained often fled their flocks or exploited fear for profit. People began to wonder, if God's chosen fall to plague, who among us is truly safe? If prayers fail, what is left to believe in? The Black Death fractured the authority of the Church, sowing seeds of doubt that would bloom a century later in the Reformation. Religious fervor turned darker. Flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, crying out that the end was nigh. Scapegoats were hunted. Jews were blamed, accused of poisoning wells and bringing God's wrath. Pogroms erupted in cities like Strasbourg and Mainz. Thousands were burned alive or driven out. Another crime layered onto the chaos: culture, art, and the shadow of death. The trauma of the plague sank deep into the bones of culture. In art, the key, dance of death, dance macabre, became a haunting motif. Skeletons waltzing with kings, popes and peasants alike, a reminder that death is the great equalizer. Writers like Boccaccio, in his Decameron, portrayed survivors not just as mourners, but as people retreating into hedonism, wit, and cynicism. A darker, more realistic vision of the world began to emerge in literature, painting, and even theology. The seeds of the Renaissance, ironically, were sown in plague-soaked soil. From desolation, a new world begins. By the early 15th century, Europe was a changed continent. The death toll had shaken its foundations, but from those ruins rose new ideas. The rise of wage labor and the merchant class set the stage for capitalism. Scarcity of workers drove technological innovation in farming and textiles. With church authority weakened, people looked increasingly to reason, science, and humanism, early steps toward the Enlightenment. What came after the plague was not merely survival, but a transformation. a rebirth through ashes. Epilogue. Caffa's echo. It began with a siege, with a gate breached not by sword, but by sickness. The Black Death did not just kill millions, it rewrote the script of civilization. It exposed the fragility of institutions, shattered dogmas, and forced humanity to adapt or perish. From the desolation of Caffa, the modern world slowly began to take shape.